Cartoons in the 1980s were chaotic in the best way. Studios were throwing everything at the wall: robots, talking animals, space adventures, and then, just when you thought it couldn't get weirder, they smashed entire shows together. Why? Because kids loved it, and executives knew crossovers meant instant ratings. But here's the real question. Do you actually remember them? Or did these surreal mashups slip right out of your brain? Let's rewind and uncover some cartoon crossovers you probably forgot ever happened. The Jetsons Meet the Flintstones, 1987. It sounds like a fever dream, but yes, it really happened. The future met the past in a full-length, made-for-TV movie. Hanna-Barbera was already dominating Saturday mornings, and someone in the office clearly said, "Hey, let's combine our two biggest families." The result was the Jetsons Meet the Flintstones. George Jetson ends up back in the Stone Age, while Fred Flintstone and his crew get a taste of the futuristic world of flying cars and push-button meals. The movie stretched to a full 90 minutes, which, let's be honest, was a bit much. By the time Fred and George even look each other in the eye, you've already sat through nearly half an hour of setup. But once they finally share the screen, you get the kind of goofy time-clash comedy that made these characters icons. The Flintstones stumbling over future tech, the Jetsons panicking at dinosaurs, it's all there. Was it groundbreaking? Not really. The humor leaned on endless sight gags instead of tight writing. But it cemented the idea that these universes coexisted, and for fans of both families, it felt like cartoon royalty shaking hands. Today, it's remembered less for being great, and more for being one of the most ambitious TV experiments Hanna-Barbera ever pulled off. Yogi's Treasure Hunt, 1985. Yogi Bear didn't just stick to Jellystone in the 1980s, he went global, dragging half the Hanna-Barbera roster with him. Yogi's Treasure Hunt was a syndicated series where Yogi led an all-star cast: Huckleberry Hound, Snagglepuss, Quick Draw McGraw, and even Top Cat on wild treasure hunts. It was Hanna-Barbera's way of keeping their old stable of characters alive by putting them in fresh adventures. What made this crossover work was the pure randomness. You'd see Scooby-Doo rubbing shoulders with Boo Boo, or Augie Doggie trading lines with Secret Squirrel. Each episode played like a Saturday morning variety show with a paper-thin plot. There's treasure somewhere, villains are chasing it too, and chaos unfolds. The plots didn't matter. It was all about seeing so many familiar faces in one place. The show leaned heavily on slapstick and puns, making it feel like an early cartoon version of a greatest hits tour. And for kids, it was perfect. You didn't need to know all the characters. You just knew it was going to be funny seeing them collide. Hanna-Barbera essentially created their own cartoon universe long before Marvel or DC made shared worlds cool. It wasn't high art, but it was a nostalgic buffet of every character your parents grew up with, squeezed into one colorful adventure, the Scooby-Doo Dynomutt Hour. If Scooby-Doo and the gang weren't busy unmasking crooks, they were teaming up with Dynomutt, the bumbling mechanical dog sidekick. The Scooby-Doo Dynomutt Hour originally aired in the late 1970s, but became a rerun staple in the early 80s, so a whole new generation grew up watching the crossover. It paired two shows with very different vibes. Scooby-Doo was spooky mystery, while Dynomutt was pure superhero parody. The magic came from the contrast. Scooby and Shaggy would be running in fear, while Dynomutt fumbled with malfunctioning gadgets and tried to play hero. His partner, the straight-laced Blue Falcon, often got dragged into the chaos, creating a bizarre triangle of comedy, suspense, and clumsy heroics. It might sound messy, but it worked because the writing leaned into the absurd. The mysteries were often secondary to the comedy of seeing Dynomutt ruin Blue Falcon's plans, only for Scooby and the gang to stumble into solving everything. For kids, it felt like two different worlds smashed together in the funniest way possible. The crossover's lasting legacy? It proved Scooby-Doo was flexible enough to survive any mashup. Whether it was with Batman, the Addams Family, or a robot dog, Scooby always came out on top. And honestly, seeing him team up with a superhero, even a malfunctioning one, made this one of the more charming forgotten oddities of the 80s. Yogi's First Christmas, 1980. Hanna-Barbera loved holiday specials, and Yogi's First Christmas was one of their crown jewels. Clocking in at nearly 2 hours, this TV movie was less about plot and more about stuffing as many Hanna-Barbera characters as possible under one snowy roof. Yogi, Boo Boo, Huckleberry Hound, Snagglepuss, Augie Doggie, and even Mr. and Mrs. Ranger all show up. The story? Yogi wakes up from hibernation just in time for Christmas at Jellystone Lodge. Naturally, hijinks follow. Yogi trying to run the lodge, Scooby-like antics with decorations, and a string of side plots involving other characters. It was basically Hanna-Barbera's holiday version of a crossover event, with the big hook being that it was Yogi's first Christmas, because he'd always been asleep for the holiday. The appeal was never about originality. It was about comfort. Kids loved seeing their favorite characters in a festive setting, and parents loved the idea of a safe, wholesome holiday movie that kept kids entertained. Watching it now, it feels like a time capsule of Saturday mornings, with familiar voices and laugh tracks echoing over simple but heartwarming gags. It may not hold up to modern animation standards, but at the time, it was event television. Families taped it on VHS, rewatched it year after year, and it cemented Yogi as more than just a picnic basket. Thief. In the grand tradition of holiday specials, this one delivered exactly what it promised: familiar characters, a cozy setting, and enough cartoon charm to last through the season. He-Man and She-Ra, The Secret of the Sword, 1985. This wasn't just a crossover, it was a launch pad. In 1985, Filmation released He-Man and She-Ra, The Secret of the Sword, a full-length animated movie that doubled as She-Ra's debut. It was a bold move. Take the most popular action cartoon of the early 80s, then spin off an entire new series by introducing a long-lost twin sister who was just as powerful. The story had Prince Adam discovering his twin, Adora, who had been raised under the control of Hordak, the main villain of She-Ra's world. With the help of the Sword of Protection, Adora transformed into She-Ra and joined forces with He-Man. The two fought side by side, combining Eternia's muscle-bound fantasy with Etheria's magical rebellion. For kids in the 80s, this was massive. You weren't just getting a new adventure, you were witnessing the expansion of an entire universe. The crossover gave both shows more depth. He-Man gained a sister, She-Ra got an instant spotlight, and the villains now had a broader playground to cause chaos in. The legacy is undeniable. Secret of the Sword showed how crossovers could be used not only as fun gimmicks, but as storytelling engines that built entire franchises. It wasn't a quick stunt, it was a game changer, giving us one of the most memorable cartoon heroines of the decade, Laugh Olympics. Before kids ever argued about superheroes, Hanna-Barbera had its own shared universe showdown, Laugh Olympics. Originally premiering in the late 70s, it kept running in syndication all through the 80s, so plenty of kids grew up thinking of it as brand new. The premise was simple. 3 cartoon teams competed in Olympic-style games, complete with announcers, scoreboards, and outrageous slapstick. You had the Scooby-Doobies, featuring Scooby-Doo, Shaggy, and the Blue Falcon. The Yogi Yahoos, led by Yogi Bear and his Jellystone crew. And the Really Rottens, a lineup of Hanna-Barbera villains trying to cheat their way to victory. It was literally cartoons doing sports, but the fun was in seeing unlikely characters, like Captain Caveman or Hong Kong Phooey, line up for relay races or ski jumps. What made this work wasn't the sports, it was the personalities colliding. You'd see Shaggy try to run hurdles while a villain set traps, or Quick Draw McGraw trying to play referee. The comedy was broad, the animation was recycled, and the outcomes were predictable. But kids didn't care. It was the first time so many Hanna-Barbera characters felt like they belonged in the same world. Looking back, Laugh Olympics feels like a precursor to modern crossover events. It showed how powerful it was to unite characters under one roof, even if the competitions made no sense. It might not have aged well, but in the 80s, this was as close as cartoons got to an animated Super Bowl. Fred and Barney Meet the Thing, 1980. This one is pure Saturday morning strangeness. Hanna-Barbera thought it would be fun to take the Flintstones and mash them with Marvel's The Thing. Yes, you read that right. Fred Flintstone and Barney Rubble were placed alongside a teenage version of The Thing, who wasn't even the Fantastic Four's Ben Grimm, but a kid named Benji Grimm who could transform into a rock monster by clashing two magic rings together. It was part of an anthology block where the shows didn't really share episodes, but the marketing made it seem like they were hanging out. So you'd watch Fred and Barney in one short, then suddenly see The Thing battling goofy villains in the next. NBC bundled them together under one title, giving the illusion of a true crossover. Why did it happen? Likely to squeeze more juice out of two recognizable brands. Kids who loved Marvel might stick around for the Flintstones, and kids who loved the Flintstones might get curious about The Thing. The execution was clunky, but the novelty made it memorable. Today it feels bizarre. Two worlds with nothing in common crammed into one block. But in the Wild West of Saturday mornings, anything was possible. Fred and Barney never actually fought aliens with The Thing, but the branding burned the idea into kids' memories. And honestly, the thought of Barney trading jokes with a rock monster is hilarious enough on its own. Fred and Barney Meet the Shmoo, 1979 to 1980. If Fred and Barney meeting The Thing sounded strange, just wait until you hear about their crossover with the Shmoo. For anyone who doesn't remember, the Shmoo was a white, blob-like creature from Al Cap's Lil Abner comic strip, who Hanna-Barbera adapted into his own cartoon. He was cute, stretchy, and could transform into just about anything. NBC packaged him alongside Fred and Barney in yet another anthology-style block. The result was Fred and Barney Meet the Shmoo, a title that promised interaction, but mostly delivered two separate shows stitched together. Still, the branding made kids think Bedrock and The Blob shared a universe. What's fascinating is how much faith studios had in the Shmoo. They thought this odd little character could carry a show and even boost the Flintstones. The animation was cheap, the plots were thin, but kids tuned in anyway because the package made it feel like a crossover event. Looking back, it's easy to see why this one faded into obscurity. Unlike superheroes or talking animals, Shmoo never had the staying power. Pairing him with Fred and Barney was a gamble to give him legitimacy, but instead it mostly confused audiences. Still, for a brief moment in Saturday morning history, the Shmoo was big enough to share billing with cartoon royalty. And that's the kind of weird trivia the 80s did best. Scooby-Doo meets Batman. This one technically began in the 1970s, but it found a second life in the 80s thanks to constant reruns. Scooby-Doo meets Batman paired Mystery Inc. with the Caped Crusader and Robin in 2-hour-long specials that kids devoured for years afterward. For many, these reruns were their first exposure to Batman outside of comic books or the Adam West Show. The formula was simple. Scooby and the gang stumbled onto a crime, Batman and Robin swooped in, and together they unraveled the mystery. The villains weren't Joker or Two-Face. They were smaller-time crooks like the Penguin and Joker-light bad guys toned down for kids. But the fun was in seeing Scooby and Shaggy bumble around, while Batman stayed perfectly serious. What made this crossover stick was the contrast. Batman brought gravitas, while Scooby brought slapstick. Watching Scooby faint in fear while Batman calmly explained the clues gave kids both tension and comedy in one package. The mix was surprisingly smooth. and it made Batman feel approachable to younger audiences. By the 80s, these specials were rerun so often they became part of the standard Scooby-Doo canon. For many fans, Scooby teaming with Batman wasn't a one-off. It was just part of the universe. That legacy carried so far that modern Scooby cartoons still joke about Batman appearances. All because two TV specials kept replaying for years: Yogi's Space Race 1978-79. In the late 70s, Hanna-Barbera looked at Star Wars mania and thought, we need in on this. The result was Yogi's Space Race, which continued airing into the early 80s in syndication. It took classic characters like Yogi Bear, Huckleberry Hound, and new creations like Spacey Lacey, then dropped them into an intergalactic racing competition. Think wacky races, but in outer space. Each week, the characters piloted bizarre spaceships across wild planets, dodging obstacles and sabotaging each other along the way. The races had little continuity, and the animation was standard Hanna-Barbera stock. But the fun came from seeing familiar faces reimagined as sci-fi adventurers. Yogi in a space helmet? Instant comedy. The show even introduced new characters like Captain Good and Phantom Fink, who became cult favorites among hardcore HB fans. The mashup of old and new was Hanna-Barbera's attempt to stay relevant in a sci-fi obsessed era. Did it work? Sort of. It never reached the heights of Scooby-Doo or the Flintstones, but for kids glued to Saturday mornings, it was another colorful, chaotic crossover that mixed genres without hesitation. Today, it feels like a time capsule of how studios chased trends. Space was hot, crossovers were hot, and Hanna-Barbera was always ready to combine the two. Yogi's Space Race wasn't timeless, but it was bold, silly, and very much a product of its time. Muppet Babies and the Lucasfilm Fantasies, 1984 to 1991. Muppet Babies wasn't your typical crossover machine, but in the 80s it pulled off something no other show could. It borrowed from Star Wars and Indiana Jones directly, with Lucasfilm's blessing. Yes, those fantasy sequences where Baby Gonzo dressed as Darth Vader or Kermit swung across a chasm like Indy weren't parodies. They were officially cleared crossovers. For kids, these moments were electric. You'd be watching a goofy nursery adventure, then suddenly the music swelled, and there was Baby Fozzie waving a lightsaber or Piggy flying the Millennium Falcon. The show mixed actual film footage with animation, making the fantasies feel bigger than life. What made it work was tone. Muppet Babies was all about imagination, and by tapping into the two most popular film franchises of the era, it turned pretend play into something epic. The fact that George Lucas himself allowed his worlds to appear gave it credibility. These sequences didn't just entertain. They introduced younger kids to Star Wars and Indy before they were old enough to see the films. In a way, Muppet Babies became a gateway to pop culture itself. Today, fans still talk about those crossovers as some of the boldest and most magical moments in the 80s animation. Hanna-Barbera's All-Star Comedy Ice Review, 1982. Yes, this was real. Hanna-Barbera characters didn't just stick to cartoons, they hit the ice. The All-Star Comedy Ice Review was a televised skating special where costumed versions of beloved characters like Yogi Bear, Scooby-Doo, Fred Flintstone, and Huckleberry Hound performed comedy routines and dances on an ice rink. If that sounds surreal, it was. Imagine Scooby-Doo doing a double spin while Yogi Bear tries not to crash into the wall, all while a laugh track tells you it's funny. The review was part performance, part spectacle, and entirely a marketing push to keep these characters visible in as many formats as possible. For kids, it was a thrill to see their favorite cartoon stars come to life, even if the costumes were bulky and the skating wasn't Olympic level. Parents appreciated that it was safe family entertainment, the kind you could watch together during prime time without worrying about anything more intense than Yogi slipping on the ice. The crossover aspect came from seeing so many Hanna-Barbera legends on the same stage. They weren't animated. They were larger-than-life mascots. But the effect was the same. A mashup of cartoon icons sharing space. Looking back, it feels bizarre and dated, but at the time, it was proof of just how far these characters reached. They weren't just on Saturday mornings. They were a franchise capable of stepping right into the real world, skates and all. Casper and the Angels, 1979 to 1980. Casper the Friendly Ghost had been around for decades, but in 1979, Hanna-Barbera gave him a futuristic makeover. Casper and the Angels placed him in the year 2179, teaming him with 2 female space cops who were clear nods to Charlie's Angels. This mashup of ghostly comedy and sci-fi adventure carried into the early 80s, making it one of the stranger forgotten. Crossover's Casper, known for his sweet and harmless personality, suddenly found himself riding in flying cars and helping his angel partners chase down cosmic crooks. The tone was lighthearted, but the setup itself was unusual, combining a mid-century comic character with a trendy 70s TV reference, and then throwing both into a futuristic cartoon world. The crossover aspect wasn't just between Casper and the Angels, it was about merging genres. You had slapstick ghost comedy, space-age action, and the girl power detective formula all rolled into one. It was a lot, and maybe too much, which is why it only lasted a season. But it's fascinating as a time capsule. Studios were desperately trying to modernize old properties, and Casper was their test case. The result may not have been a classic, but it's a perfect example of how the 80s cartoon world never hesitated to experiment, even if it meant throwing a ghost into outer space. Yogi's Lark. Before there were cinematic universes, Hanna-Barbera was already experimenting with giant crossovers. Yogi's Lark was originally a 1-hour TV movie in the early 70s, but it reran throughout the 80s, giving a new generation the joy of seeing almost every Hanna-Barbera character in one place. Think of it as the animated Noah's Ark, except the animals could talk, sing, and crack jokes. Yogi Bear took the lead, guiding a massive ark filled with his cartoon friends, Huckleberry Hound, Quick Draw McGraw, Snagglepuss, and more, as they sailed off to find a perfect world free of problems. Along the way, they encountered pollution, greed, and other real-world themes, presented in a kid-friendly format. The charm of the special came from its sheer size. Seeing so many beloved characters together felt like a Saturday morning dream. Each one got a little spotlight moment, whether it was helping solve a problem or just delivering a quick gag. For kids in the 80s, the reruns made it feel like a brand new epic, one that proved Hanna-Barbera could rival Disney in terms of shared character magic. Yogi's Lark wasn't just a crossover, it was a declaration. Hanna-Barbera had built a universe, and this special made sure everyone knew it. Even if the moral lessons were heavy-handed, the joy of seeing so many characters under one roof made it unforgettable. The Smurfs meet Johan and Peewee, 1980. While the Smurfs are remembered as self-contained, their universe actually had roots in Peyo's earlier comic characters, Johan and Peewee. In several 80s TV specials, the Smurfs crossed paths with the brave page Johan and his sidekick Peewee, blending medieval adventure with the magical Blue Village. The crossovers leaned into fantasy storytelling. Johan, a knight's page, often found himself in trouble, and the Smurfs became his allies. Peewee, the comic relief, played off the Smurfs' mischievous side, creating a balance between action and humor. These specials were faithful to the original Belgian comics, which had always included both sets of characters, but for American audiences, it felt like a surprise crossover. For kids who only knew the Smurfs from Saturday mornings, suddenly seeing them fight alongside humans in castles and battle magical threats was mind-blowing. It gave the Smurf world a larger scale, hinting that their adventures weren't limited to mushroom houses and forest hijinks. The specials may not be as widely remembered as the main show, but they added depth to the Smurf mythology. They also reminded audiences that even the tiniest, most whimsical characters could fit into a larger fantasy adventure. It was one of the rare times where the crossover felt like it expanded the universe, rather than just cashing in on it. Top Cat and Friends, 1980. Top Cat might not have been as huge as Scooby-Doo or Yogi Bear, but he got plenty of syndication love in the 1980s. Networks bundled him together with other Hanna-Barbera stars in crossover-style blocks, marketed as Top Cat and Friends. The episodes themselves were reruns, but the packaging made it feel like all these characters lived in the same shared cartoon neighborhood. Kids flipping through Saturday mornings would see Top Cat rubbing elbows with Quick Draw McGraw, Magilla Gorilla, or even Wally Gator, all stitched together under one banner. The illusion was strong enough that many thought these characters actually interacted behind the scenes, even though they were just repackaged shorts. The crossover magic wasn't in shared plots, it was in the branding. By putting them side by side, Hanna-Barbera created a universe effect, similar to how comic books advertised multiple heroes in one issue. For kids, it felt like Top Cat wasn't just leading his alley gang anymore. He was part of something much bigger. Looking back, this was a smart move by the studio. Instead of letting older shows fade, they rebranded them as part of an all-star team. It wasn't flashy like the Jetsons meet the Flintstones, but it kept these characters alive in the public imagination. And honestly, seeing Top Cat introduced, as if he was hanging out with the likes of Snagglepuss, gave him a prestige bump he probably needed. Alvin and the Chipmunks meet the Wolfman and Frankenstein. Before the Chipmunks were singing Bad Romance in CGI movies, they were starring in quirky crossover specials with classic movie monsters. Alvin and the Chipmunks meet. Frankenstein and Alvin and the Chipmunks Meet the Wolfman began in the late 70s, but aired repeatedly throughout the 80s, cementing their spot in Saturday morning culture. These specials mashed the wholesome chaos of the Chipmunks with the gothic spookiness of Universal-style monsters. The result was equal parts comedy and mild creepiness. Alvin, of course, usually caused the problem, befriending a misunderstood monster or stumbling into a haunted castle, and Simon and Theodore got dragged along for the ride. For kids, it was the perfect balance of scary and silly. The monsters weren't truly terrifying, they were more like bumbling guest stars. But the crossover gave Alvin and his brothers bigger adventures than just singing covers of pop songs. They were suddenly part of a larger, timeless tradition of monster comedy. What's impressive is how well these held up. They played every October, often side by side with Scooby-Doo marathons, creating a crossover tradition of their own. For many, it was their first introduction to Frankenstein or the Wolfman, reimagined as kid-friendly foils for Alvin's antics. It may not have been the biggest crossover of the decade, but it was one of the most rewatched. He-Man and She-Ra, a Christmas special, 1985. When you think Christmas, your mind probably doesn't jump straight to swords, sorcery, and Skeletor. But in 1985, that's exactly what kids got with He-Man and She-Ra, a Christmas special. This TV movie pulled together both Masters of the Universe and Princess of Power for one giant crossover event wrapped in holiday cheer. The story kicks off with Orko accidentally traveling to Earth, where he befriends two kids just before Christmas. Naturally, he whisks them back to Eternia, and suddenly the holiday spirit becomes the center of a showdown between Skeletor, Hordak, and our twin heroes. Watching He-Man and She-Ra protect Christmas while battling villains gave the usual action-packed formula a surprisingly heartwarming twist. What made it work was scale. This wasn't a one-off cameo, it felt like both universes truly collided. The voice cast, animation style, and story tied both shows together in a way that felt seamless. Kids who only knew He-Man got introduced to She-Ra, and vice versa, all under the glow of a Christmas tree. The highlight? Skeletor himself accidentally catching a bit of holiday spirit, showing a softer side for once. It turned what could have been a cheesy cash-in into something that fans still look back on fondly. For an 80 seconds crossover, this wasn't just strange, it was oddly perfect. A holiday reminder that even in a world of swords and sorcery, kindness and teamwork could win the day. The Flintstones' New Neighbors, 1980. Bedrock's getting weird guests in. The Flintstones' New Neighbors, a primetime special that first aired September 1980. Fred and Barney are shocked when a bizarre new family moves into the house next door. The Frankenstones. This isn't one of those throwaway cameos, it's a full special that turns Bedrock's quiet neighborhood on its head. What makes this crossover adjacent is that the Frankenstones had already appeared in Flintstones lore. But this version introduces a new family unit with distinct design and personality, building on earlier interpretations. It's as though the world of the Flintstones suddenly expanded. Familiar routines of prehistoric suburban life now have monstrous neighbors who aren't quite human and bring in weirdness. Fred and Barney have to adjust. Familial rivalries flare, and the special pokes fun at the absurdity of coexisting with monsters in Bedrock. The animation was done partially overseas in Madrid at Filmin Studios, giving the backgrounds and designs slightly different textures than the original Flintstones episodes. The Frankenstones designs here are spookier, more exaggerated, leaning into the monster side more than earlier versions. It was a rare chance for both normalize and lampoon the idea of monsters as neighbors rather than villains or outsiders. Mini conclusion. While not a crossover of two wholly separate cartoon universes, the Flintstones' New Neighbors acts like one bringing in characters who feel from another world, forcing the main cast to react, adapt, and laugh at the absurd. It stands out among specials for its willingness to stretch what normal Flintstone stories looked like, and fans tend to forget it's more than just another Bedrock gathering. Hanna-Barbera's 50th, a Yabba Dabba Doo celebration, 1989. By the end of the 80 seconds, Hanna-Barbera wasn't just a studio, it was a Saturday morning empire. To celebrate, they aired Hanna-Barbera's 50th, a Yabba Dabba Doo celebration, in 1989, a massive TV special that brought together nearly every character the studio had ever created. Instead of one quirky crossover, this was the ultimate roll call. Hosted by Tony Danza and Annie Potts, the special blended live-action segments with animated clips and appearances. Everyone was there. Fred and Barney, Yogi Bear, Scooby-Doo, the Jetsons, Huckleberry Hound, Hong Kong Phooey, even deep cuts like Magilla Gorilla and Rough and Ready. It was less about new adventures and more about showcasing how these characters had shaped pop culture for decades. The vibe was celebratory and nostalgic, mixing behind-the-scenes insights with playful skits. Kids who had grown up with Hanna-Barbera in the 60 seconds and 70 seconds got to revisit old favorites, while younger fans discovered just how wide the cartoon universe really was. The cross-company mashup wasn't about telling one story, it was about reminding audiences that all these shows belonged to the same legacy. Looking back, this special felt like the true finale to the crossover craze of the decade. It gave Hanna-Barbera's universe the recognition it deserved, and proved that even without a single shared plotline, just seeing all these characters celebrated together was powerful enough. The 1980s might be remembered for neon colors, arcade games, and Saturday morning cereal commercials. But cartoon crossovers deserve just as much credit. They turned TV into an unpredictable playground where the past met the future. Dogs teamed with superheroes, and even a blob named Shmoo got a shot at fame. Some were classics, some were bizarre, but all of them proved that the power of cartoons is in their ability to collide. Which one do you remember best, and which one shocked you most?